2025 is over and it saw very successful Russian offensives. Of course, this is because Russia has the manpower, the equipment, the supplies, everything to be able to do offensives and continue to do offensives. They've got a large force, so they can afford to do offensives. The Ukraine has been doing an alright job at slowing down the offensive, with the exception of the offensive that rapidly got to the outskirts, got close to Pokrovsk. I think that was disastrous, but it seems hopefully Ukraine is now better at stopping the offensive, and hopefully that won't happen again. Of course, I haven't seen any proof that the Ukraine is chopping down the trees along the railway lines, so I think the Ukraine should do that. Another thing the Ukrainians did, which was very successful, the Kursk offensive. But if you look at the Kursk offensive, you'll notice that there was you'll remember that there was some Russian forces whose logistics train went over a river or close to the front line. So I think a lot of Ukrainian people are saying, oh, they're going to get encircled, it's going to be a great victory for the Ukrainians. That never came. That's because the Ukraine didn't have the offensive power to launch the offensive there, only to launch the initial offensive. So what happened is those forces actually did a counter-offensive and pushed the Ukrainians back eventually. So I think the plan for the Ukrainian forces should be to keep the front line stable, hold the line, build lots of defensive lines, and secondly, have at least 2 offensive forces, offense and counter-offense forces. So that way when there's a Russian offensive, they can launch a counter-offensive. Once the offensive line is slowed down, and then that pushes the Russians back. Or, for example, in a Kursk situation, when those forces were surrounded, not surrounded, but when those Russian forces were pushed up against the river, the second offensive force could have launched an offensive and caused massive casualties, captured a lot of Russians. Would have been a great success, and because that would have given a better defensive line, shorter Kursk front line, that meant that Russian counteroffensive in Kursk would have been more difficult. So I think the Ukraine should establish 2 reserve offensive brigades who can be used whenever they want. And I think another thing I think the Ukraine should focus on is making the war sustainable. I think they should have a set war goal. I think Zelensky's insane plan of 1991 borders is ridiculous. I think the main goal of the Ukrainians should be to get back at Zaporizhia and Kherson. I think they should, and that should be the goal of negotiations, and also keep the parts of the Donbass they already have. So, if that's the Ukrainian plan, well, Russia may not accept that. I'm pretty sure they won't accept it. But if the Ukraine can continue the war going for a long time, then Russia may be forced to accept. Or if things are particularly bad in Russia, then the Ukraine can revert their war plans to the original 1991 borders. So I think the Ukraine should be prepared to give back most of the Donbass and the Crimea in exchange for peace. So as for mobilization, I still believe women should be conscripted, and so I'll put my plan down simply: build 2 offensive forces and reserve offensive forces, well, not reserve offensive, but offensive forces who sit behind the front line waiting to be used. Build better defensive lines, bigger and better defensive lines. Mobilize women, I think I already said that. And accept and change victory goals and negotiate. Of course, with Donald Trump coming into power, he may cut supplies to the Ukraine. But I think the Ukraine doesn't need American supplies, especially considering American hasn't given much already. So I think America is. I actually don't. I really hate America. They give basically nothing, but because they deliberately overpay for weapons, they claim that they give all the weapons and stuff, and that's not even true because Europe gives more money and stuff. In terms of money spent, Europe is still high. So, don't have much more to say except that is all.